All right, it's all yours.
Mallory, thank you so very, very much, and greetings, everyone. I don't know how many webinars I've done, but someday I may become acclimated to this form as a type of teaching. It's the reason I find it challenging is because I love working with a in-person audience, and I know you're there, and I'm going to trust you're going to laugh at the appropriate moments, and all the other reactions, the nonverbals that I'm going to just imagine are there. Also, I was reflecting on the opportunity to be with you tonight and thinking I probably know some, but not all of you. So if we haven't met before, I'm grateful for this opportunity to say hello. And my function at Caron is on our Pennsylvania campus in the residential addiction treatment program that is the historic centerpiece of Caron's offerings. And I am our lead chaplain there. And we have chaplains on campus in Pennsylvania and also chaplains on the ground in Florida. And they all report up to me, and it's an amazing group of folks. I feel amazingly privileged to do that. And my other big role is as the principal presider for Caron's historic chapel service on the Wernersville campus. If you've never been to our Sunday chapel service, I would really encourage you to check it out. It's a unique and prized offering, and people come away with all kinds of rich experience from it. And it's a great way to know about what we do and how we do it. Mallory pointed to the subject matter. I have my slides up here. We're calling this tonight Pathways to Recovery. It's not necessarily an obvious thing for a chaplain to speak about. So I think I'm going to be able to weave in why this is a key piece of information for me. But it's also become an area of focus for me. In fact, oddly, I did a lecture for patients on Monday that uses some of these same slides. I'm privileged to be with you tonight. And then tomorrow, I'm training Caron staff around our entire continuum for this same material. So I think that points to the fact that this is very current and very urgent, and hopefully very relevant for you. I'm going to try and keep in mind, too, that most of you are loved ones rather than persons who may have identified specifically as needing recovery for yourself. My deep belief is that a family doesn't just pop an addict into being, and that it's really important to take a look at the family system as a context in which this illness presents. And Mallory also hinted at language, so you'll hear me use language I'm trying to get deconditioned to use. These days I like to use what I think of as the best phrases that are available for us, and I have to retrain my own brain. I just used the word addict in a kind of a pejorative tone, but I'll do my best to exhibit what I think of are the most effective ways to talk about this population and these circumstances tonight, and you'll catch on, and hopefully you'll find, if you have any questions about why I use certain terms, please feel free to ask. All right. The presentation has a couple of different things. I'm going to sprint. I know I talk really fast anyway, and I'm sure we can make this PowerPoint available to you if it's helpful. And I don't like to just read slides to people, but if there is a presentation that I'm going to rely heavily on my slides about, this is one of them, and you'll see why as we get into it. Here's an overview of where I'm trying to head. I want to talk about why people need to be involved in mutual support as a part of recovery from addictive disease. I'm going to talk about the different choices people have in the, Mallory talked about models, that's a good word. Where do you go for mutual support? And then I'm going to summarize a little bit of the language I've been using as I go through that presentation. And then I have some final comments about, in the midst of this complicated landscape, do you have to take it all in, or can you make some individual choices? So it's a bit of an ambitious calendar, but we have a nice chunk of time. And here we go. So why is mutual support so important in addiction recovery? This particular slide that I just flipped up, which has the 3 bars on the right, draws on, and at the end of this PowerPoint, there are academic citations. So the whole presentation is driven by some research that I've been paying attention to. This particular slide draws on an article that is pointed for nurses who are going to work in mental health. And so obviously, if you're a psychiatric nurse or a nurse working in a mental health facility, you're going to come across the phenomenon of a substance use disorder. And as a nurse, you're not going to prescribe treatments necessarily, but you're going to recommend and support the patients that you encounter. And so in educating nurses, this article says there are 3 types of helps that patients with a use disorder are going to benefit from. And 2 of them are kind of obvious, and the one is the one that's in question tonight. But today there are medications that help people who suffer from a use disorder. And today there are also individual group therapies that help people suffer from use disorder. And each of those are areas of expertise in and of themselves. So you might want to learn about the pharmacology, the naltrexone or Vivitrol or Suboxone in its various forms. And you might want to learn about the individual group therapies. And there are acronyms: CBT, DBT, ACT, EMDR. These are various models for how a clinician works with a client to help them address a particular aspect of their mental and emotional struggles. Those 2 things, pharmacology and therapy, have been proven to be important in helping people with addiction. And the analogy I want to use tonight is, if you were going to a doctor for a cancer, you might have surgery, chemotherapy, or radiation. Those are the 3 common interventions. And when you go to an oncologist, unless you're already with a radiation oncologist who specializes in just the one thing, but if you're going to your lead physician, the questions that you have are, doc, do I need surgery? Do I need chemotherapy? And do I need radiation? And the answer in all 3 of those cases with cancer is maybe. And it depends on you and your illness and where it is and how aggressive you want to be. So this is very similar here. If you're a patient with a use disorder, you come to a place like Caron or an addiction clinician, and the question is there a medication that would help me? Which? Is there therapy that would help me? What kind? And then finally, do I need, and this is the typical way people ask, do I really need to go to AA? Or, can I go to Smart Recovery, or can I do Recovery Dharma? Or you're going to learn all these different options. Or can I just rely on medication and therapy alone? So historically, going back to 1935, the middle bar there, mutual support, has been the primary solution. In recent years, pharmacology and therapy has taken a kind of a front and center role in addiction medicine. And the peer and mutual support has been kind of grudgingly adopted by the docs and psychiatrists who have clients suffering from these problems. But I'm going to flip one more slide here. Here, at the end of the very academic slide, I'm not going to read any more than I'm going to point to the bold red type there. But this is about 3 different articles and how these 3 different articles inform the question, doc, do I really need to have a mutual support component of my care? In the first article that's cited here, John Kelly is his name. I've met him. He's a researcher at Harvard, and folks at Stanford, so 2 highly reputation academic institutions who do work on substance use disorder care, published this comprehensive article in 2020 that surprised the researchers themselves and was kind of a major milestone in the academic understanding of substance use disorder care, because it threw a wrench in this previous idea that pharmacology and individual group therapy were the most important, and that the mutual support thing could help. Instead, what Kelly and others found in their research was that AA was more effective than therapy alone, or therapy and medication alone. So that in fact, of these 3, the one you would not want to do without, so sort of like, to me, in cancer care surgery. If a doc can do surgery, you want surgery because you like to get rid of that stuff. And then you may want chemo and radiation, or you may want chemo or radiation, but you pretty much always want surgery. Well, that's where we are today with addiction care. You have to recommend mutual support because it's been proven to be more effective than the other two options. And it in fact outpaces, it can alone get pretty good outcomes. So, and that particular piece of research in 2020 was focused specifically on 12-step interventions. So TSF is 12-step facilitation. But the two articles which precede it enlarged our understanding here for tonight. So in 2018, there was a study that was done, which compared 3 different options. One was 12 steps. One was a thing called Smart Recovery. And the third was a thing, I think, Women for Sobriety was the option. So these were 3 different mutual support choices that were existing in 2018. And this particular small study followed the outcomes for people who chose one of the 3 and found very little difference between the 3 choices. So if we take seriously the first one, which is that a 12-step mutual support option is really very important, and then we take into account the second article, what that says is you have you might be able to avail yourself of any of the choices that are out there. So if we're drawing an analogy to this as surgery, in prostate cancer, for example, there are various different surgeries that are available. And in this case, it would be like, it doesn't even matter which surgery you pick, you could just pick whichever one, but you wouldn't want to go without it. And then we always want to know why. I mean, it's fine to be able to correlate statistically an action with an outcome, but there's always the speculation of why. What is it that mutual support participation contributes? And then this study, which goes back to 2016, and didn't look at addicted patients, but it looked at more acute mental health patients like psychosis or dual identity disorder, very seriously mentally ill folks. And the study showed that serious mental health patients who participated in peer support found better connectedness, belonging, and improved coping. And I think that you can apply those findings. I'm speculating here, but I'm going to say that that's why I think mutual support is so important of some type. And I will confess, as a person in recovery myself long-term, I've been clean and sober for a really long time. I'm grateful for that. But I do continue to participate in mutual support, renew and sustain my recovery. And the one thing I'm most expert about is 12 steps, because that's been my program of choice, and it's the one I'm most literate about. But I do feel that today, as a professional in this area, when people like you send us your loved ones, I have an ethical responsibility to be knowledgeable about all the choices that are out there, so that I can tell you and I can tell your clients, when they're your loved ones, when they're our clients, what their choices are. So I want to give you a quick zoom through, what kinds of choices there are. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it's going to be close. And the categories are not always entirely mutual exclusive, so there may be a little bit of bleed through from one group to the other. But those of you who are paying attention, you're going to learn a lot that you might not have known. I would guess there's probably no listener who knows all of the next maybe 10 slides. And the way I'm going to take you through it is through the way these slides are laid out is really important. So there's 3 columns, there's a header, and then at the bottom you may see hyperlinks, little website jump spots. So every slide that you're going to see, I'll flip forward and then back. Every slide except that one looks like that. So there's one I dropped in there in the middle, but all of these slides. And so it's a choice for mutual support at the top and the description of what it is, and then features, benefits, and common criticism. And so welcome to this survey of pathways to recovery. AA is the oldest, founded in 1935. It's the biggest. They count more than 2 million worldwide in membership. That's a very fuzzy number. If anybody really wants to know, I can talk about how it both may overcount and undercount. It first went into print in 1939 with a book that still is used and continues to generate material online and in hard copy. Great things about the 12-step approach are it's available around the world and in any language, pretty much. And because of the Kelly article that I was just telling you about, it's proven to work. There was a time when people used to say AA was not evidence-based. That's a common concern of our clients and of people in this area of care. But today, John Kelly and his colleagues have helped those of us who really have benefited from this path to be able to say research supports this as a choice. So you can definitely choose AA and know you're in the evidence-based lane, and you can recommend AA in similar variants to your loved ones. And if they say, I don't know, research doesn't support it, you can say, well, actually it does. And this is all just because of the last couple of years. AA went online in a big way during COVID restrictions. So it's a bit of a newcomer to that world. Some of the others have been online longer. And if you are new to this whole world, if you just have a patient with us, for example, right now, or you've just been invited to kind of join this thought world, and you're wondering why does everybody talk about this so much? It's this is an analogy here that this is like aspirin, which you would talk about with Tylenol and ibuprofen and naproxen and all those different similar medications. It's the first in the category and the one that kind of defines the genre. Or in antidepressants, it's Prozac. So you can learn so much by learning about AA that then you can apply even if you don't make AA the choice that you follow. Just because you learn to read a map published by one company, like if you on your iPhone, if you use Google Maps, then you start using Waze. You know how to learn things by using the first one. There are people who are not really a big fan of the 12 steps, and I like to, in my mind, divide them into two camps: people who have done the work to be informed about their criticism, and people who turn away on an initial glance or based on the concerns expressed by others. This is for like a restaurant or something like that. And today we read reviews in restaurants, and gosh, you have to be really careful to sort of sift through some of that stuff, because the two things that happen is you get angry customers who comment much more frequently than delighted customers. And so that skews the information you see on the web. And then also you're an individual person, so comments that somebody else may have may not be the experience that you have. So this is true of every one of these slides, is that I would encourage you to take these criticisms with a grain of salt. I would not have put a slide on here if I didn't think it was respectable. And I've already confessed I'm a big fan of this one. So AA is awesome. And here's a chaplain. It is often viewed as overly religious and spiritual in focus. Totally true. It's not very religious to be defensive, but people find it to be religious because in 1939, when they were trying to write in a religiously inclusive way, they didn't do that very well. So the 1939 literature comes across as very Judeo-Christian, and even very Christian within that set. So Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, agnostics often struggle with the literature. That said, there are lots of people in each of those four camps who do very well in 12-step meetings. So sometimes it's a red herring, and often we'll have people who say, I'm not going to go to AA or whatever because of the God stuff. And the truth is, if you could remove all that stuff, they still would find another reason why they're not going to go. So it's can be useful in that sense as a straw claim to dismiss that. And but also there are people who have been very deeply wounded by their encounters with traditions of faith, and it's certainly a sensitive topic. So it's not always the easiest on-ramp for people. Another concern that people have is just the fact that most of the literature does date back now almost 90 years. And so it's patriarchal and old-fashioned. And I think a lot of people wish that people would update the literature, but the large following makes it very hard to even have that discussion because there are a lot of traditionalists within the movement. It is a peer movement in the extreme. It's one of the unusual things about 12-step programs and mutual support is that there's just zero oversight. And if for some reason a gathering on Tuesday night in your hometown goes off the rails a little bit, either starts charging people when it's supposed to be free, or starts having someone who is, conducting themselves in an unpleasant way, or, they start endorsing marijuana or whatever. There's really no formal way to have that correct, other than that often I think people who subscribe to this method will say that it corrects itself, because this is a method that has persisted for so long that that those kind of departures from the tradition tend to not last. And then this last bullet's important. There is a whole theme that undergirds the 12-step approach, which is a turn away from self-reliance and the ability to rely on the mutual support that you find in AA. And as a result of that, and I think influenced by the fact that in the 1930s, most of the people who participated were men, they take a hard critical view of pride and describe most of the community presumptively as arrogant. And so often women or very humble and quiet, not prideful people find that off-putting. And so AA is not necessarily for everybody. And all those objections that I just listed have, to some degree, a legitimate expression based on some people's experience. Keep in mind, though, that often many humble and religiously wounded people who prefer contemporary language are in AA meetings all the time. So it just depends on how willing the person is to, abide their finding aspects of the movement challenging. And we do this all the time, you and I, in various ways in which we participate in things that we don't get to control. So I want to keep moving, but I needed to spend a good bit of time on this one in order to set the tone. And you will notice each one of these has a 12-step, an internet reference there. So this one you can learn more about at aa.org. Now, there are other 12-step programs, and you may have heard, for example, of Narcotics Anonymous. CMA is an abbreviation for Crystal Meth Anonymous. And I finally modified this. This is a Wikipedia page that shows all of what I call the A fellowships. If you look, every one of those acronyms ends in A. And if you see somebody recommending mutual support, I said that an exception there is Al-Anon and Alateen, which is funny because those fellowships are of importance for this particular audience tonight. But they do fall into A fellowship. When I say A fellowships, what I mean is ones that use the 12 steps as a guide for the structure of the process that participants go through. So different 12-step programs are out there, and they are good in that they get more specific, and there are differences in different kinds of addictive disorders, and there's value in being with people who are more like you with the same kind of problem that you have. But the counter negative that comes with that is that it's a smaller pool. So none of these can rival the millions of people who are in the 12-step AA program, because it's a narrower subset. And so it's good to know these things are there. And I have a sibling, a brother, who's a Narcotics Anonymous guy. He's my brother James is clean, coming up on 40 years. And James is a big NA advocate, and he's taught me a lot about NA. And I've gone to a ton of meetings with him of that program. I find all of these programs to be very much compatible. They're very similar in large ways, but they also are different. If you just want to think about it in a simple sense, like notice the little parentheses about food and sex. One does need to eat, and one is likely to continue to have physical contact in sexualized ways, even if one has become a person with disordered eating and or a person who has had problems with over or under like healthy amounts of sexual behavior. And yes, there are sexual anorexics, by the way. So the bottom line, and that's a phrase that comes from these programs, of a food program or a sex-related program is not pure abstinence. And then that changes the nature of a 12-step program, because in Narcotics Anonymous, you seek to be abstinent from narcotics, and Alcohol Anonymous, you seek to be abstinent from alcohol. Crystal meth, so in all the other ones, it's kind of a nice, clear bottom line. You just stop doing this behavior. But in some of these other programs, it gets a little more complicated. Even gambling is not so easy. Like a gambler can block themselves from casinos and take the apps off of their smart device, but they probably still have a 401k, and they have to make decisions about investments in that, or they can hand that off too. But it's pretty hard to live a life that purely insulates yourself from these things. And anyway, that gets a little, I get lost here if I keep going too far in that. But there are lots of 12-step forms, and the things that are true about the first of the 12-step forms will extend to apply to the other 12-step forms. And there are even almost all of these have a family related component. So I should say that right now. Every slide that I'm going to talk about, with one or two exceptions, there is an analogous parallel community for the loved ones of people who are participating in the primary community for their abstinence or modified behavior. And so I'm guessing I'm not telling anybody here on this talk anything new about that. Al-Anon is the big one for AA, although there is also maybe it's Families Anonymous or something like that. But there are a couple of programs, an Alateen for younger family members, and ACOA for people who grew up in addictive families. There are parallel offerings that benefit loved ones, so that the entire system, the entire family system, can participate in compatible recovery. Now we're going to take a quick departure into a really apples and oranges kind of thing. This is an orange and the others were all apples. SMART, neat thing. It started in 1994, and it is an acronym. Self-Management and Recovery Training is what the acronym is. And instead of a 12-step program, it's a 4-point program. Some people are mistaken about SMART and think it's a moderation program. It's not a moderation program, but it does do things differently. So for example, SMART meetings do not have the same etiquette. In a 12-step meeting, it's typical for people to identify and use a label like, my name is Jack, and I'm a, let's say, food addicted person, or crystal meth addict, or an alcoholic, or whatever. That doesn't happen in a SMART meeting. You would just use your first name. My name is Helen, or whatever. And then also, SMART avoids the coins, medallions for anniversaries. It takes a quite different approach on how it supports people who are not managing to stay abstinent, so they don't use the term relapse. I'm not a big fan of that term myself, but I think it's because of the non-use of the stigmatizing labels and the not use of the coin and medallion thing that people get this misconception that it's permissive and maybe even encouraging to continued use. And I would not encourage anybody to go SMART if you're planning to try and control the behavior rather than cease it. So SMART is an abstinence-oriented program started in 1994. And when it began in 1994, it used to be able to brag that it was evidence-based and the other choices were not. But as I keep pointing out, since 2020, the work by John Kelly and others puts SMART in a different position of saying it's among the evidence-based choices. And what I would say to sort of continue on the theme for SMART is that SMART is, I'm making up a word here, sciencey. SMART is very, very analytical and practical and clear and has a science-like feel. In many ways, people find it similar to being in group therapy, although it is a peer program. And SMART has trained facilitators rather than being peer-led, which makes it in another way quite different from the other ones. SMART has a good footprint. It's in a lot of different regions around the nation and the world. There's a really strong Australian contingent. I'm not sure why, but and it's in multiple languages. And there is a family and friends SMART thing, and there are family and friends meetings and family and friends resources. So it's truly a rival of the 12-step fellowships in its breadth and scope and reach. And it really is different. So it's not just more of the same. And it appeals to certain people. And one of the things that is interesting about this at the end of the talk, I don't chew up all my time, I'm going to say something about which ones, some of these mix with others more easily. SMART is one of these things that you can do a little bit of and do another one as your major sort of choice. Or you can make SMART your major choice and do a little bit of something else. So it plays well with others. And there's more to learn about all these things, and you can learn about it at smartrecovery.org. I need to pick up my pace a little bit. Recovery Dharma and its predecessor, Refuge Recovery, are two choices that exist out there for clients with substance use disorder and or other addictive presentations. SMART 2 is one that is kind of one for all. So there's not a cocaine SMART and a opioid SMART and a marijuana SMART. There's one SMART for people with whatever they're addicted to. And similarly, Recovery Dharma and Refuge Recovery emerged on the scene in just the last 9 years as ways to apply Buddhist principles to support your recovery. This too is an apples and oranges. This is the grapefruit. This is totally different. And where SMART has 4 points and the AA fellowships have 12 steps, the Buddhist teachings include what is referred to most often as an 8-fold path. So there are 8 kind of points of emphasis to learn in Dharma or Refuge, and there are 4 in SMART, and there are 12 in the 8 fellowships. There's an origin story, and Refuge is receding in its popularity, and Recovery Dharma is the one to really learn about, if you ask me. Recovery Dharma is a newer attempt at applying Buddhist principles to addiction recovery, but very similar to the one that was put out in 2014. And as it says on the upper right, that's partly because there was a scandal involved in the founder of Refuge. And so that doesn't apply at all to Recovery Dharma. The folks who had followed the original founder, many of them broke off and decided to try and restart the movement. And this Recovery Dharma movement is now gaining traction very well. And its material is excellent and lovely. As it happens, in case you would be curious, Recovery Dharma, Smart Recovery, and 12 Steps all are offered directly to clients on our residential treatment campus. And that's a great thing about Caron, and not always true in other treatment offerings, but we make this available at least as a thing that you can taste and experience as a client when you're a person in our care. So we really do have a strong buy-in to all three of those modalities that that can support long-term recovery. And if your loved one says, I'm going to do Dharma instead of AA, I would say, be excited and say, that's awesome. I'm glad you're picking something, yeah. And there are not a lot of Dharma family and friends resources, but there's no reason why a person without an addictive disorder wouldn't find Dharma interesting and lovely and beneficial. So you could certainly participate in applying Buddhist principles to your day-to-day life and learn a lot about it. There's a lot of meditation in the Recovery Dharma and Refuge movements. And there's a lot of evidence in mental health care that meditation helps with anxiety, depression, other compulsivity disorders, and with cravings. So it's no surprise that this is out here as a contemporary choice. And by all means, if your loved one is interested in it, I would encourage it. It's now also very much available online, and it's not anywhere near as widespread in numbers of languages or numbers of meetings in person around the country or the world as the other offerings, but it's getting there. And it can definitely be at least one's primary program. We just had a patient today who was talking in a lecture about this and saying that his preference is Recovery Dharma. Well, he lives in Philadelphia, and even in Philadelphia, without a long drive, he can't really do a meeting every day. So he does 2 or 3 Dharma meetings a week, and he does 2 or 3 12-step meetings a week. But Dharma is really his lane, and the 12 steps are just a way of him supplementing that to be making sure he's supporting his recovery every day of the week. So these are good examples of how people apply this landscape of choices. I think we're going to move faster here. So the Phoenix is sober active community, and this is wellness, runs, CrossFit, yoga, and organized movements. It's a intentionally supplemental thing. So you can be in AA and add the Phoenix. You can be in Smart and add the Phoenix. You could be in Dharma and add the Phoenix. And I think it's awesome. I just want to make sure people know about it. And it's easy to find the wrong websites, but that happens to be the right website for this movement. It's not in every town. It's not in every, it's not even around the world yet. Although it's been out for quite some time, as you see in 2006. And it's a way of having fun and sobriety with people who are also trying to be healthy and abstinent one day at a time. So good thing to know it exists and really appeals to certain people who want to do a strongly wellness-oriented program of recovery. Women for Sobriety, quite interesting. 1973 came out of the New Thought movement, but it also came out of, it was like a we are not AA thing, an anti-AA bent. And that was partly because women are still very much outnumbered in the 12-step world. And women are different than men. And I think I can say that without too much conflict. And then the New Thought movement is a very different spiritual movement. And so this is a movement that uses positive affirmations. If you think about Eckhart Tolle and the Power of Now, or other people who just like to have positive messages on their daily calendars or text messages that encourage and cheer them up, or those kind of things. This is the kind of we're getting healthy and well together is the general spirit of this movement. Some people have criticized this movement for being overly positive, which I think is funny, but I do understand the criticism in that I was trained when I'm working with a client who's in a very dark place to not just be cheery to them. So It might be if you were a person who was really in a tough, dark spot. The cheerleading aspect of this program might not feel like a fit, at least at the beginning. But it's there, and it's women specific. There's also a sober sisters movement, which I think has more of a 12-step analogous structure. And there are some women specific things. And there are also LGBTQIA plus 2S variants of these things. So in fact, there was lots of, for example, LGBTQ AA meetings. And I'm going to jump one further here. So, and then I'll go back to life in a second. There are what I just said about LGBTQ. There are also specifically 12-step meetings for people of Christian faith. And there are specifically 12-step meetings also for Muslims. And I suspect you might be able to find ones for other faiths, but I know for sure there are Islamic 12-step fellowship resources, and there are Christian 12-step fellowship resources. And the most commonly known is Celebrate Recovery in the Christian Camp, although the one at the bottom in the middle, Life Recovery Groups, is my personal favorite of this category. And you can read the slide in more detail if this is something that interests you, but I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here. I'm going to go back quickly. This is LifeRing. LifeRing starts in 1999. It came out of the West Coast, and I always tease when I present this material, but because I have these biases about West Coast versus East Coast cultural differences. But part of what I think is very interesting about LifeRing, and I do think has that flavor, is that if you look at the red in the middle there, LifeRing organizes to some extent around difference. Every person who identifies as a LifeRing person crafts their own recovery program. They do have 3 points. We're sober, we're secular, and we're self-directed. But that means that beyond those 3 points, it's very, very varied in terms of how people put LifeRing to work in the support of their own recovery. So I like to think of this almost as like the land of the misfit toys. This is a group that appeals especially to very staunch atheists. It's a group that appeals very strongly to people who are quite willful and like to feel like they get to do their own thing in their own way. And so just to let you know it's out there. It's available online and in major cities like New York, Boston, and DC, and San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. You can find in-person LifeRing meetings, but there's a robust website and there are online community meetings for people who want to go this direction. And also one last thing, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but there is a program for people who want to control their use. And if this is your loved one, this is a way of being on board with a person who wants to do a harm reduction approach in your family system. And I say that cautiously because if that person has already gone to residential treatment, I would never recommend this to somebody who's already been in rehab. And I tell all of our patients that, even though I do include this slide when I do this information for our current patients. Moderation is a thing that works for the majority of people, but it's kind of by definition what accepts you from needing treatment. So the red flags like a DUI or the loss of a job or the erosion of a marriage over substance use conflict tend to be diagnostic. They tend to identify a person who is unable to dial back their own use. And they can maybe try participating in moderation management to see if having a group of people help. It's like, shared dieting does help people. But the large majority of people, once those red flags have manifested in their lives, will only succeed in the improvement of their life circumstances through a program of fairly rigorous abstinence. And yes, there can be a recurrence of the illness, and we should not shame people when they're struggling to achieve and sustain abstinence. But but we do want to applaud and affirm that abstinence is the optimal path for people once various hallmarks have occurred that show that a use disorder is present. So there it is. And one of the poetically tragic things about this is that the woman who founded this movement ended up taking her life after lots of painful presence in the media, as she was not able to use her own tools to dial back her own drinking. And in fact, she did avail herself of 12-step programs to try to find abstinence, and she just had a very tough journey. So God rest her soul. I'm doing a little bit okay. I got like 8 minutes in terms of my stated intentions for time. So if you'll allow me, and I'm sorry for being so rapid fire with all this stuff, but I came out of AA 30 some years ago. And in those days, you would hear things like these quotes here. How can you tell if an addict is lying? His lips are moving. Ha, ha, ha. I also remember hearing people say, if you don't find a higher power, you'll never get this program. And tough love is the only thing that will work in cases like I've heard all of these things said over and over again. And I've only, in the last 15 years, been encouraged to think about those kind of statements in a very different way. And there's a method called motivational interviewing, which we train as colleagues in, that Caron and most other addiction treatment providers acknowledge as a very helpful method for working with clients. And one of the things that motivational interviewing evolved from is understanding that shaming, ridiculing, blaming, and like the kind of really harsh, tough love stance. I'm not a person I'm all for boundaries, but that the words matter, and that there are careful ways to choose our wording to stay in a loving and empathic place as we watch someone struggle with these problems and seek to find, or maybe not even ready to be able to find help. And so I say that teaching and preachy stances often are really off-putting to folks who are defensive and in their own hearts quite fearful, may doubt whether it's even possible for them to modify their own behavior because they are not able to modify it on their own. And one of the fundamental axioms of the motivational interviewing approach is that a client has to choose the path forward for themselves, even if I know and I'm able to put in front of them a choice. It's only in their decision to adopt that choice for themselves that transformation occurs. The development of motivational interviewing looked at tons of encounters with doctors and patients in which the doctors quickly diagnosed and said, this is what you need to do. And the compliance rate or adherence rate to those recommendations is in most cases below like 30%, really shockingly low. So you go to the doctor says you have a this, you have a that, and this is what you need to do. And later, people don't finish their medications, they don't do the medications, they don't change their diet, they don't lose weight, they don't exercise, they don't call the and schedule the next appointment. There's tons of things that don't happen. And then it's very easy for the doctor to say, well, so you'd have gotten well if you had just followed my directions. And oh my gosh, this is a tragic truth in many people's quests for health, is that they've encountered this dynamic and it has been dispiriting for them. So I hope that if you as a person participating in this training are blessed, that you will find people who can help and support you in your quest along with your loved ones to a better life, that adopt a recovery-oriented model that frames the journey in a positive way, offers excitement and hope, and understands that there are many methods, ways to get to a better place, and that each of us must choose from those choices what we think will work for us best. And so that's the spirit of my time with you. Hopefully you've heard me exhibit all these things on the right and try to avoid some. I can't shake the word addiction. I'm especially not a fan of the word addict because it's so scarlet lettering. But substance use disorder and use disorder is the best contemporary medical language for the phenomenon that we're talking about. Mutual support instead of the program or 12 steps is a more inclusive notion. I do believe addiction is disease. I haven't spent any time on this particular jump, but I absolutely am completely convinced of it. At the same time, I believe recovery is about more than just arresting the disease. So I think that people who acquire the disease of addiction can find it eventually paradoxically a benefit in their lives, because in acquiring the competencies that help them overcome the use disorder are the seeds of skills which will cause a life to flourish. And so there's really some weird hope that is right around the corner for people who come into our care. I've always been trying to get Caron to adopt recurrence as the language. I did notice recently in a medical article that was addressing this in the case of cancer, that relapse is a term that is used with cancers of certain types and in certain instances. So, but I think there's a pejorative shaming connotation that's got attached and the stigma attached to the relapse label. So, it can be powerful in a way to say, we're worried about you because it seems like your illness has recurred. And in general, and I think that there is a opportunity for those of us who get to be around people who are suffering in this way to utilize the love and compassion and empathy that we have as a very potent tool. And in order to do that most effectively, the hurt and the resentment and the bitterness that we may also be feeling is one of the most dangerous components of what's within us. And finding ways to heal that within ourselves and with other people is often a really wise way of helping the dynamics of our relationships move to a better place. I only, in my own, I had a cancer thing in 2008 that went on for many years, and I learned a term in that, which was that I was told I was suffering from refractory illness, which meant that my cancer was not responding to treatment. And I was like, oh, wow, that's such a good term. So many people have refractory use disorders. They have been in treatment 2 or 3 times and they're still struggling. And I really believe at that point, there's a real question about whether the treatment has been able to be effective. This happens in schooling all the time. We have kids who are not doing well in school, and the schools are beginning to learn that that may be because the education is not taking, not because the student is failing to be receptive. So just cautionary things about that. And I think this is my next to last slide. So my next to last slide is all going to wrap up in the learn one well. I believe that the AA, Smart Recovery, Dharma, what's the other one that falls in? Women for Sobriety, that these are systems unto themselves. They're little worlds of knowledge, tips, tricks, jargon, history, culture, events that are quite as robust in and of themselves the only way you get to be an expert is by, just like the only way you really learn to learn language extremely well is through an immersion. The only way to become a doc besides med school is then to do residency and fellowship. We do this with clergy. We train clergy with academic instruction, but then there's always field education, and usually there's a transitional process before becoming fully ordained or credentialed, where you work on the ground with on-site supervision. These are the, I'm missing a word, but in the early days when a welder, for example, would take in somebody in order to weld, we would apprenticeships. These, there are things that we learn only in non-academic ways. And I believe recovery's in that category, that like playing tennis or learning a musical instrument, there's academic knowledge that goes with it, but there is the practical acquisition of the complexities of the enactment of the model that only come with immersion over time. So why I bring that up is dabbling is dangerous, given this wide range of options that I just fanned out in front of a newcomer. And going to Dharma on Mondays and SMART on Tuesdays and AA on Wednesdays and Christian-based 12-step on Thursdays and Life Ring on Fridays is at very best, it's a very long approach to acquiring any kind of mastery in any of them. So while you might want to take a cafeteria approach like that for a couple of weeks, I really think the purpose of such a raising exposure would be to find one in which to then locate oneself and seek to develop connectedness, belonging, and acquire the literacy, the fluency to learn the accent and the language and the slang, and really be able to talk the talk and walk the walk of its thought world. And then later, if you want to layer in something else, go for it. But I would not, if you're watching your family member play hummingbird in 6 different nests, I would use a motivational interviewing approach to try and elicit understanding of why that's how they're approaching their recovery. And as a family member, you may want to, this is at my last slide, as you may want to try and figure out like which one would you be able to partner with, and then in doing some of that together, I think families recovering together is so powerful. In interfaith families where you have a Catholic partner and a Jewish partner, it's very hard to just totally mix those. But we also have a lot of families that I encounter where you have like a Catholic and a Protestant, and those are so close that they can kind of decide one to do one or whatever. But it's in the doing of these things together that very powerful bonds form and very powerful healings occur. So I guess what I'm saying is if you as a family member are going to Al-Anon and your loved one is going to Recovery Dharma, you're not learning the same language of recovery. It doesn't mean that there won't be immense benefits accrued to each participant in what they're doing. There surely would be. But there's missed synergy that could be present if the paths were more in parallel. So yeah, I've done my best to convey a whole bunch of things, including, I hope, an underlying spirit of enthusiasm. There's all my academic stuff. I've really appreciated your attention and time to be with you. I'm going to ask our facilitator to jump back in and give me some direction.
Thank you, Reverend Jack. That was amazing. I'm just going to stop recording here for a second.